Having thought about how the kingdom of God is going to be proclaimed throughout the whole world before the end comes, and also how the fullness of the Gentiles is going to provoke Israel to jealousy, we're now going to think about what can enable that to happen and how it can help us become more alive to God. It's the gifts and the calling that God gave to Israel to empower them to be a light to the nations, that the first believers got hold of through how Yeshua had redeemed them, so firing up those first believers about the coming of his kingdom on earth that through their sense of its nearness, they turned the world upside down. And see how this points to these very same gifts and calling being what will enable the end-time fullness of the Gentiles to happen, as well as the proclaiming of the good news of the kingdom throughout the whole world before the end comes. Because for at least a remnant of believers to be just like the first believers were, this means they'll need to be empowered by the gifts and the calling that God first gave to Israel and which Yeshua then redeemed. And this means that they will have to be free of every negative consequence of the 16th century reformers' belief that the church had replaced Israel, that cornered them into saying that God's promises to Israel could not be taken literally and had to be considered just as allegories, especially regarding the literal end-time kingdom on earth, when Yeshua will reign and rule with righteousness. And the possibility of such an end-time remnant of believers being so fired up in this way about the nearness of God's kingdom on earth as a literal truth is not as far-fetched as it may seem, because here's the climax of Paul's Romans to 9:11 passage when he said about Israel concerning chosenness, they are loved on account of the fathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. His great emphasis on Israel's gifts and calling being irrevocable, meaning that however unique the circumstances of the first believers, the empowering that these gifts clearly produced cannot and will not ever be withdrawn. In other words, they were not just for back in the day, but will be available right up to the last day. And what's more, this means they must be available to us today, so that if we will do what it takes to find them and to draw from them, our own ability to know the nearness of Yeshua's end-time kingdom on earth will be greatly enhanced, as will be our ability to share it with others, and which is so urgently needed, given the escalation of signs that indicate that the end may not be far away. However, it's still for us to find the flow of this and then to get into it, and it's not immediately clear from this one verse where to or how to find it and do it. Because whilst we know what the irrevocable calling of Israel was, Paul did not say at this point what the irrevocable gifts actually were. And if we only have the third millennium Gentile viewpoint, our best guess may be that they're the charismatic gifts like speaking in tongues or prophecy and words of knowledge and so on. But valuable as they are, these can be expressed without any reference to God's continuing purposes through Israel. And furthermore, Yeshua warned not to gauge our aliveness to God through our experience of them, saying, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and perform many miracles in your name?' Then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" So, whilst the charismatic gifts will doubtless play a vital part in the end-time proclaiming of the good news of the kingdom, It's clearly a different set of gifts that Paul was referring to. And by saying that they validated the chosenness of Israel through them being loved on account of the fathers, he then gave a huge clue about where we can find them. This being in God's dealings with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which then points us to the list that he launched his Romans 9-11 passage with, saying about Israel, to them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises. To them belonged the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, the Messiah, who is over all, God blessed forever. So evidently, Paul had identified how these were the very particular gifts that God had given to Israel to enable them to have such immense potential that they could be a light to the nations. Through how the gift of adoption singled them out as God's firstborn, to whom and through whom he'd uniquely chosen to reveal himself. And how the gift of glory rooted them in its relationship with him through their many divine encounters. And the gift of the covenants anchored them in obedience to his unchangeable purposes. And then through how the gift of Torah communicated the truth they were to focus on. The gift of temple service gave them the pattern for living out their priesthood in every aspect of their lives. And the gift of his promises were the measure of his enduring faithfulness through all their ups and downs. Now, if these gifts are just looked at through the lens of replacement theology, they don't look really as impacting or empowering as the charismatic gifts, which is one of the reasons why today's church is not as empowered as it needs to be for the times we're in, let alone for what it will take to boldly proclaim the good news of the coming kingdom before the end of this age actually comes. So, as with all the gifts we ever receive, we need to understand why they were given to us, if they are to have the consequence they were intended to in our lives. And this means we need the Jewish perspective on them to see through the Hebraic values of the God of Israel, rather than to see them through the Greek values that shape our Gentile way of seeing things. And which we can get into by considering the natural giftedness that God gave to Israel, such as how when King Frederick the Great of Prussia asked his physician what evidence there was for the existence of God, his answer was, "The Jews, Your Majesty." Because just like the signs of spiritual truth that God puts in the natural realm, we can see for ourselves how true this is about Israel, and especially how the natural gifts he gave them really were irrevocable, such as through how no other nation has maintained its identity for 3,500 years, much of that time outside its land and facing great persecution, and how the modern nation state was born in a day, as prophesied in Isaiah 66, to become the only nation to revive its ancient language and use it as its contemporary tongue. And then thriving for over 70 years back in its historic land, even in the face of constant threat. And though only forming 1/5 of 1% of the world's population, that Jewish people are disproportionately present at the top of most professions, and 1/4 of all Nobel Prizes have gone to people who were either Jewish or had Jewish ancestry. This and much, much more, even despite most of Israel not acknowledging how every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So, even though the spiritual gifts God gave to Israel are not prominent in the same way the natural gifts are, at least for the moment, their irrevocable natural giftedness helps us to see how, when their spiritual giftedness is finally and fully recovered, it'll turn the world upside down. Being a bit like the land of Israel, which back in 1859 was described by Mark Twain as a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. But today it blooms and affords the highest average living standard in the Middle East. Its potential having gone unrecognized for so long, but then emerging as its people finally return to it in significant numbers. However, this leads to a big question, which is about whether we Gentiles who are grafted into Israel can draw from its spiritual gifting even now ahead of Israel's final return to the Lord. One reservation being that the hidden spiritual giftedness of Israel might be very like the physical giftedness of the land, the blessing of which we Gentiles can now enjoy, but it's only because Israel has finally returned to the land. But even if that were true, the possibility is still already there, because today there's more messianic believers in the land than at any time since the first believers. And though there's still only a tiny percentage of the population, this means that the way is already opening up to do so, because they are there in the land today. Then secondly, there'll have to be a build-up to the proclaiming of the good news of the kingdom throughout the whole world, as well as to the fullness of the Gentiles that will precede the final saving of all Israel. And as the spiritual gifts that God gave to Israel will be such an essential part of it, they must be getting increasingly accessible to those who understand why God gave them to Israel and how Yeshua redeemed them. And then there's his unconditional encouragement that everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it shall be opened. For what man among you, when his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or when he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So for these reasons, we're going to think about each of the irrevocable gifts that God gave to Israel to see how we might draw from them to become more alive to God and then better able to fulfill the calling of our time, which is to witness to the increasing nearness of the kingdom of God on earth. But first, let's think about these three questions. What does being called mean to you? What does being gifted mean to you? And what does being empowered by God mean to you?